Oh, there we go. Hello, everyone. A bit confused today after flying in from Panama last night. Um, Interesting because, of course, that ties in with our jump from Asia into the exciting world of the Caribbean. And I'll have a place where you can see videos of some of well, two of the biggest writers from the Caribbean. Earl Lovelace from Trinidad. We'll read one story by him. And Derek Walcott, one of the first I recorded in St. Lucia, has won a Nobel Prize, and Panama is an exciting place because of the great mixtures of people going back in the main to the construction of the Panama Canal. In that spirit, and in light of that, you want to read to at least page 70 in Z. Edgel's exciting novel Becca Lamb. And we have one more to read, so you can start on that one too whenever you like, Potiki. You're going to be reading a lot of novel things, although I did take out two or three short stories from the other readings so that it lessens the burden. You can pay more attention, and specifically to Becca Lamb and these other aspects of the Caribbean, including Latin America and the Caribbean, that introduction in your book. Um, you'll learn some interesting things, some of which will show up on the quiz, um, including the idea that one of the biggest industries of the Caribbean is in fact tourism, not oil. Although Trinidad has oil, as you'll find from the poem by Derek Walcott, I believe it is, that you'll read for next week. This week, you have a coming of age novel. There is a video about it. There won't be big class notes in the first 70 pages or so, but I'd suggest you read more just to get a good jump on where we're going here. It takes place in the 57 or so, I think 59. You'll find that there's a talk about an arrest of these two people, and that's true. The PIP, I think, is uh, the the political party that finds its roots back in the 50s that leads eventually to the independence of Belize from Great Britain. Belize is the only English speaking of the Central American countries, though with the influx and it's a small country bordered in the main by it starts with G. I can't, not Honduras, but it's not Guadeloupe. Anyway, I'll figure it out. Has a strong Spanish movement, and so you'll find that Belize is basically Spanish and English now. Our story, though, you want to understand the some of the conflicts that are going on in here, especially from the grandmother and the mother and the father and the child and her best friend, who we find in the very beginning of the story has passed away. Um, so pay attention to them. I mean, the father, you want to remember, Bill, good name, works for the British. The grandmother, who goes to all the political rallies and whatnot, wants independence. So at Bill's house, he's always feeling like no one listens to him because the grandmother is anti-British. He works for the British, so he has to be careful. And he, as you're going to find out, has sacrificed a lot for the family. And the wife wants to plant roses in the garden. I mean, she's a nice person, but roses are not what we would call native Central American flowers. But she's reading these British magazines. She wants to straighten Becca's hair. Um, be thinking about these things as you read, because you want to look at the various groups too that are involved there, the Mexicans, the whites, uh, and the potential conflicts, and also the Asians who and others who run stores and things of that nature. I don't know if there are a lot of Asians, Chinese food stores and whatnot in Becca Lamb, but believe me, and the Chinese are the greatest traders in the world, and you're going to find their restaurants pretty much wherever you go. There's another book called Crick Crack Monkey. Uh, and I think in our story, though, it's not one of the Belizeans. It's one of the Mexicans who comes and works hard, as the father says, not one of the Creoles. In this case, mixed blood. And you're going to find even that they talk about a white ancestor, as you'll see. Some of these conflicts come into the play when you think of Becca as a young girl growing up in a household that argues all the time, and you're going to find that she learns completely different things whenever she goes to school, which adds to her own conflict. Now, uh, although Z. Edgell, which also often happens to authors, has uh, denied that Becca Lamb kind of serves her own psychological struggle as she's growing up, and her search for, you might call it just identity, really serves as a microcosm for the entire country. Um, well, she might say, I didn't mean that, but doesn't mean that we can't look at the book and think of it in these terms. And also the problems of a young girl in these areas. She, for instance, she's petrified to become pregnant, and you'll see why. Not only that, but I mean, not only with her friend, but also when she looks around, there's one pineapple-faced girl, she calls her, and she's younger than Becca, but she's like had 3 children already. And the idea is if you get pregnant, your life is pretty much determined. As the mother and the grandmother say, if you don't do your work, you may as well start washing things underneath the house, or something to that effect. So look in there. You're going to have a vacation, and then they're going to have the death of another grandmother. And have the whole kind of thing with Becca being punished because she's a liar. But that doesn't bother her so much as that if the father tells her that she's not, what is the word that he uses? Uh, she's not real in the way she's kind of fake. Uh, and that just destroys her. But she does make up stories. One of them, which is that she passed and can go on to the next forum, and she can't until she gets it right. But she has things to, and not ideal, but not legitimate. It's just not uh, what you see. And this is you'll think of the word that I'm looking for in my fatigue. It's just escaping my mind. But um, this is more, her bruises are more than, calling her a liar, because she knows she lies. And notice the gift that the mother gives her, and the other great gift will be that she'll be allowed to go back to school. There are lots of things to look at in the book, and you can move in various directions on that discussion thread. I just put girl down as a foundation for discussing. This is Jamaica Kincaid's what we call prose poem. And when you look at that, look at the notes. But in that poem, it's about a girl's relationship with her mother. And in this one, in many respects, it's the mother telling the girl about what it is to grow up and be a woman. And the Jamaica Kincaid's character in it, the narrator, um, is feeling a conflict. And in Jamaica Kincaid's works, especially one, I'm trying to think of the name of it, where it is about her, takes as its foundation her difficult relation between her mother that she had, because her mother had married and young and done the kinds of things that the mother doesn't want the daughter to do. And the essence the way, stay away from the sailors, stay away from this, or everybody will call you a slut. And in the novel, the power differential between the daughter and the mother, as you'll see it portrayed in this prose poem, without it's all one sentence, and basically the mother does not listen to the child and only answers her at the very end, as you'll see. And she would, in a lot of the novels, she'll, this one in particular, she looks at her mother and uh, and sees the power differential as the same as between the colonizer England and the people. So that she'll equate her mother and her power with empire. It's a very interesting and complex thing that we have going on in these stories, especially from the Caribbean, where a woman like Jamaica Kincaid is, as she notices, writing in the language of the colonial power, English and not African or even Creole. The Creole languages of these various islands were conquered by more than, in most cases, more than one person. So you have a place like Trinidad, where the language that everybody speaks is English, but all the last names are and the names of cities are Spanish, and there's a huge Asian, not Indian population there. So they come up with their Creole languages based upon a lot of it. Number one, the African syntax that the slaves brought with them, and number two, what the colonial languages were. So read about that and girl, and but when you're doing the novel, um, don't get caught up in just talking about it in from the focus of Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. There's a lot other interesting things to discuss in there. Girl, I've mentioned. Now, I'm Your Horse in the Night by Luisa Valenzuela is Argentinian, Argentine writer, and I'm Your Horse in the Night is a kind of a magic realism. You don't know if Beto is real. We don't even know his real name. What we do know, though, is it's written during the time of the Desaparadiso. Desaparadiso is the disappeared. This is a word that became a verb, and it started in Central America and in Argentina during the time in Argentina of the dictatorship, the military dictatorship that finally ended shortly after the loss of the Malvina Islands, or what we call the Falkland Islands, from the British point of view, and then revealed all the horrors that were committed, and the trials still go on of during the war. What happened to disappeared women, a lot of whom were pregnant. Turns out they were killed after their babies were born, and the high officials who wanted to adopt a child would take the child. I mean, it was a nastiness, a lot of killing. And so you had the mothers and the grandmothers of the disappeared marching in the Centreville, the center of the city, with placards, things with the pictures of the lost children, daring the government to attack elderly women, and they didn't. And the mothers of the disappeared, they were called. So Beto is pretty obviously a fighter for the resistance against the junta, and he comes in the night, and it takes Your Horse in the Night has a wonderful sexual overtones here about riding the horse and whatnot, and it's connected with folklore stories. You don't have to know exactly who they are and what they are, but the idea of someone calling up and saying, "Is Beto there?" And then you're wondering, "Oh my God, the phone is bugged." And does she really go to prison? We don't know. But the idea is that she's aligned with Beto, and not in a more traditional marriage kind of thing. So we be aware of this story, because when we get later on to the one about microbus in El Salvador, it's about the same period, and it's about the same idea. In this case, it's the military government preying on the peasants. It's a wonderful form, as the author will joke, of population control. Venezuela, Argentina now is a few people elected. Uh, they have their problems without a doubt. There's no question about it, but they remain staunchly democratic in their uh, as in free elections and things like that. They don't always agree with the United States on issues. But I'm Your Horse in the Night is a wonderful book about revolt and subversiveness. Now, The United Fruit Company by Pablo Neruda, another of your Nobel Prize winning authors. Um, Neruda was one of the world's great poets. He wrote also wonderful love poetry, but he was also a diplomat from Chile. Now, the other story you're going to read is by Isabel Allende, whose uncle was an Allende, was the first democratically elected Marxist in South America or the New World, and Pablo Neruda was his good friend, and when Pinochet led a military revolt in Chile, um, it's pretty much now we know that Allende probably shot himself instead of being captured, and they're still talking about the movie The Missing with Paul Newman and Sissy Spacek is about looking for this photographer, and now there's a new documentary out about this. They were taken with many others to soccer fields, which you find in these kind of revolutions and whatnot in Africa and other places. It's a great place to hold people. And the young man never came out alive, and either did thousands of other people. And in this boat, Pablo Neruda also died shortly after Allende passed away, or shot himself, or was murdered by Pinochet and his men. The United Fruit Company talks about something else. You have Anaconda and whatnot in Chile, the old copper mines and whatnot. They were pretty much natural. They were taken over by the government at one time. They're back to being private, but as in Peru, mining brings now a lot of it going to China, uh, significant amounts of money into the economy. But the United Fruit Company, you can look up, and I know a couple of you in the class know a lot about it. We calling them these things banana republics. Now, banana republic today means a line of clothing. The banana republics, though, go all the way back to the freedom of the independence of Panama. And we had great interest there. But we did send a battleship down there. It was a battleship diplomacy telling, I can't remember, it's the Colombians, I think it's the Colombians or the Venezuelans, had their eye on the country, and we basically supported independence movement because it fit our needs. But later on in those years, we also have supported, as your poem, The United Fruit Company, suggests, a number of these nasty Trio and others, dictators. And as the one line, I'm trying to think, it was the Secretary of War or the Secretary of State. I think his name was Walker in the Roosevelt administration. And he said, "Man," he said to Roosevelt, we're putting up with some real son of a bitches down there." And Roosevelt's reply was, "Yeah, but there are bitches, sons of bitches." And we have, and this is our legacy in Central America, and the one of its economic, and the United Fruit Company basically um, ran some of the countries um, with large banana plantations, rubber, and other kinds of things that would go in. They would build schools and whatnot, but in most cases, the money was going directly to the stockholders. I'm not anti-capitalist, but there is a way to do things. And so you'll find it in the United Fruit Company. Pablo Neruda talks about the ships leaving the harbor with their booty, which comes from pirate. And pirates, of course, they do have a long tradition in the Caribbean. But in the United Fruit Company, look at it, and it's talked about in the beginning. It's sayings like Jehovah, and they call and then divide the world between them. And Anaconda, United Fruit Company, this is the commercial division up of these islands into two these large corporations who went in and support the dictator who it does. The idea is tranquility. And so a lot of the dictators were back because they could bring order, and we turn a blind eye to how that order came into play. Um, by the way, the word that I couldn't think of before with respect to Becca was authentic. Thank you for waiting for my mind to catch up with me. So you're going to find the United Fruit Company and I'll have another poem, I think, in the notes somewhere about in Guyana, where they're talking about how wonderful that harbor is, and the wharfs and stuff that have created this wonderful, wonderful harbor in in an area, especially on the Atlantic coast of Central America, that is just not was not suited for that. And in the poem, the guy is talking about, who did build this. And this is a lot. When I was in Panama, for instance, just this last week, in the old part of Panama City, there's an impressive series of monuments to the French who began the Panama Canal. And it's basically to the people who, gave their lives up for it. These French people, engineers and whatnot. But you don't find anything quite as extravagant for the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of black labor devoted to the canal and the deaths that occurred. They're just numbers. And so you'll find in the end of United Fruit Companies talking about the one who dies, and it's another in chattel slavery. Um, uh, all the way back to Identity Card and those other ones. Is that so? When this guy is looking at the wharf that's created in Guyana, and he sees his poet's name is Clark, I believe, and he's going over this bridge that was stone bridge that was constructed, and he says, that he can hear the tongueless whispering of the slaves. And in a sense, you're finding in a lot of this literature that we're reading, it is the authors giving voice to the traditionally voiceless, whether it's uh, peasants in Belize or Indians in Chile. And that's the story of Isabel Allende, is Phantom Palace. Now, this falls in, as does I'm in Your Horse in the Night, with something we're called um, magic realism or magical realism. Don't get caught up in the definitions, but there's a lot of these ghost stories, and it's a form of wonderful exaggeration, as you're going to find in Octavio Paz's The Obsidian um, Butterfly. But it's very political in its conflicts. So in Phantom Palace, you have the woman whose name, by the way, is a famous photographer of women. In She lives in New York at the time, and it doesn't really matter. But the name is an homage to her. But she goes in the Phantom Palace. The Chile is run by one of the Indians. Has his relatives are not. He's from the mountains, if you will. His relatives are not necessarily Spanish. But you'll see that he's just a despot like everybody else, and he's petrified of anybody trying to take his power because, as usually happens with these people, they fear that everybody's just like them. And so, if he screwed other people over to get into his position of power, he assumes everybody's going to do that with him. And so, while he attracts the girl, he tells the husband, you have a choice: get out of here, or we can do something. And the husband, who only missed his wife when she wasn't by his side, or something along these lines, he treats her like an object. Um, and she's attracted to this old general you can look in there and you make your own opinions up, but she loves the country. Her husband, who's a diplomat, hates the country. She stays and becomes, for a short time, the lover of the despot. And and then you'll see that he introduces her to the palace, this beautiful palace that he has built, but it looks like oil money, some minerals, but everything's imported from Europe. And this is the idea of a Eurocentric view, the idea of empire as being the thing we look up to. But the Indians are really interesting. The phantoms, if you will, in this palace that's built out, the glorious palace out in the middle of nowhere, where our protagonist, the woman, finds peace. And you want to think about, I've talked before about how the power differentials you often find in a lot of African literature, where the wives of the leaders, or the officials, felt so powerless and so objectified and so cut out of anything in the world that they found liaisons, often sexual, with the blacks, who in many ways resembled the women in terms of politics and whatnot. And you'll find that when you think of why is the protagonist in Phantom Palace finds solidarity with the Indian, with the ghosts. And so you want to think of them as a metaphor. It's using a ghost story to talk about a lot of things. Um, and one of them is the wish and hope for something that'll change when the other despot dies. It has always been a situation in these countries. And now we've had a democracy for quite a few years after Pinochet left. As a matter of fact, a woman became the president not that long ago, who had to leave, forced to leave the country in case Pinochet, because they feared Pinochet, and the military dictatorship would come after her. So a lot of this turmoil continues on, and one of the problems is that United Fruit Company is an American company, and also unfortunately, the CIA was very, very active in the overthrow of Allende because the fear of he would naturalize a lot of these industries. And so the American government went in as they tried to overthrow Chavez in Venezuela because it's in American interests. And this is not anything new. Now, the other two poems in there, I just met one of the leading scholars of, I didn't know it at the time. I came to realize that he gave a wonderful talk that I'll make available for you. But he had written one of the great critical biographies of this poet, Nicholas Guillen, who died in the 80s, I believe. And Nicholas Guillen is an Afro-Caribbean, and was one of if Darwish was the poet of the PLO. Guillen was very much caught up in and supportive of Castro's and Che Guevara's revolution in Cuba, and you find it in poems like The Ballad of the Two Grandfathers and also Can You. It's very much in the vein of the socialist agendas of well, certainly of Castro after Che Guevara will leave because of disagreements over the relationship with the Russians. But there is this, hope that still is there in Cuba amongst the Afro-Caribbeans for a sense of equality that the revolution promised and that still awaits coming to fruition. And so this is when he talks about, Nicholas Guillen talks about the Ballad of the Two Grandfathers, one of whom is a conquistador and the other is a slave. That conflict with him is interesting. So, read about it. It'll be very different from the conflict that you'll find in a similar case with Derek Walcott when he considers his African roots and his colonial roots, which are Dutch and British. And that conflict generates energy for him, but it's not. He has to embrace both sides, but not without conflict, because he cannot believe of the horrors that go on in Africa after colonialism, if you will, and the neo-colonial horrors, the wars, and it's kind of hard when you think of what his colonial relatives did to the people they took from Africa. But he loves the English language and wins a Nobel Prize for the beauty with which he uses the language in works like Omeros and other poems that we'll read later on. Ballad of the Two Grandfathers is much more idealistic, if you will, when you read it. And you'll see how in Guillen's philosophy that the black mixing with the whites creates a beautiful hybridity. that has a certain harmony. It's a hope for poem, and the other one, Can You, um, carries a similar vein. Not all that distinctive or separate from Negritude, as we saw in the poetry of Leopold Señor, as this kind of a hopeful union, and also in Diop's poem Vultures, a rebirth of blackness, and it just hasn't worked out pretty much. One of the other critical readers, and I'll make that available to you by the end of the week too, as I get these movies and photographs ready from the conference in Panama where I served. I gave a paper on a Cuban zombie movie, wow, Juan of the Dead, Juan de los anyway, I won't try to do my Spanish today. Uh, and he's talking in his story, his reading about a more realistic and edgy, political edgy poetry that comes from the Afro-Caribbean writers at this juncture. So both of those two people are controversial and eloquent in their presentation of theoretical aspects of Caribbean literature and also, in fact, Caribbean language. So I'll make them available for you, and one other one too. These were presented in English, so you'll be able to maybe take something from them. I certainly did during my stay at the convention. So have a good week. I'll make another video for the midterm exam a little later than the other ones. I always do that in this online class. And we'll have some things I'll have some things to say about the final. And I also, reiterate that, you have to make an oral presentation of some aspect of something, and make it available on the discussion threads for your fellow readers. I don't care what it is related to the Caribbean. It can be something about the United Fruit Company. It can be something related to oil in Venezuela, and anything to do with the role even of the emperor during the Second World War. Any of those things that we've talked about in the class that's related to your particular area of interest. That would be the degree you're taking. Fine, just put up something from 7 to 10 minutes, a discussion, if you will. You can also use Prezi or, a PowerPoint with language. You have all these choices, but you want to put something together over the next 3 weeks. And that will replace Essay 2. And I'll write something more up about the correct wording there for you. Okay, I wish you another good week. Thank you for your continued strong work with the threads. I'm impressed with many of you, and so keep that up.